Good afternoon. Welcome, everyone. It's nice to see lots of familiar faces and some non-familiar ones. Thanks for joining us for the first in a series of talks and events that are open to the community and the broader UMass public from the School of Public Policy. I'm David Mednikoff. I'm a professor of Middle Eastern Studies and Public Policy and chair of the Judaic and Near Eastern Studies Department. This year, I'm co-chairing the School of Public Policy's Public and Community Engagement Committee, along with our fabulous Director of Communications, Maureen Turner, who's here as well. I'm grateful to Mo and all the other members of our community for a diverse mix of events that combine members of our community and outside speakers in the coming year. For those of you who don't already know, 2020-21, with all of its challenges, is a very exciting year for the School of Public Policy. We've become a department, and we've hired 5 new faculty members, our first full tenure lines in the unit. We're adapting our graduate curriculum to the needs of our expanding graduate student cohort and to a new undergraduate major that we should have in the near future. I hope that those of you in the unit will connect to, I hope that those of you in and also not in the unit will connect to and contribute to our growth and activities. As one of the units at UMass Amherst with a consistent focus on social justice and social equity, we at SPP feel a particular commitment this year to address compelling questions of inequality and unfairness. Our next talk on October 19th at 12 o'clock by Professor Gilda Daniels of the University of Maryland Baltimore School of Law will be on voter suppression in the United States, and I think it'll come at a very timely moment. We'll also have a community event on the Thursday evening after the election in November, and a talk by our own Professor Lee Badgett later that month on her new book, The Economic Case for LGBTQ Equality. I hope to see you at all of these upcoming events. Of course, there is no more pressing issue of social justice than systemic racial inequality. We in SPP stand with the Black Lives Matter movement and are grateful for its momentum in helping to sustain public attention on the ongoing and severe structures that sustain racism in the United States, the sort of systemic problems that we address in our research and teaching more generally. The shootings of Floyd Abrams and so many others have highlighted the role of the police as one of these structures of sustaining racism. We are fortunate to kick off our speaker series this year with someone who can address with great knowledge links between police and racial inequality in the US today. Professor Brandi Blessett will speak in a moment on the patterns and practice of predatory policing in communities of color. Before I introduce our speaker, I want to remind you of 3 ground rules for a session like this, although I know that you know these all too well. First, as I think you're doing already, please keep yourself muted unless you are speaking. Second, please keep in mind that with Professor Blessett's permission, this talk is being recorded. Third, when we get to the question and answer session, which I hope will be lively and I would love to hear from as many of you as possible, I'll moderate the questions, and the way for you to get a question in will be to send a question to me using the chat function in our Zoom link. I'll call on you and invite you to ask your question, if you like, in the order that questions come to me on the chat. Okay, rules are clear? Great. So I am now pleased to introduce our speaker. Brandi Blessett, PhD, is an associate professor, and she's the director of the Masters of Public Administration program, which has a social justice focus at the University of Cincinnati. Her research interests are integrated and seek to examine the role of institutions and administrative actions in facilitating disadvantage. Ultimately, she hopes her research will help public administrators move forward towards more thoughtful consideration and engagement of all groups in society, particularly those traditionally marginalized groups. And I just want to add that I also understand that Professor Blessett has done quite a lot of work in making her public administration program very intentional around integrating issues of social justice and equality throughout the curriculum. So I particularly encourage students to ask questions about that as well when we get to the question and answer period. Great. So with that introduction, thanks very much, Dr. Blessett, for speaking today. And the floor is yours.
Well, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for the invitation. I'm really jealous of the speaker series. It's very timely and you have some great topics coming up. I'm also very excited for you all, particularly having a program and administrators who are thoughtful and intentional about bringing these discussions to the forefront, right? Your engagement in a program is only as good as your ability to apply the skills that you learn in the classroom out in the real world. And I hope that you utilize the expertise that comes to you through these speaker series and other engagements that occur within this program to really challenge yourselves or to develop a set of skills and develop tools to effectively engage and be stewards of democracy and fairness and justice. And so I again just want to say a special thank you to the people behind the scenes. So Mo, Dr. Medikoff, Dr. Roberts, and all of the administrators and folks that really made this happen today. I'm excited to be with you. I didn't realize that I was the first speaker, so no pressure, but I'll do my best. And so I look forward to engaging with you in a conversation in just a little bit. And so today we're going to talk about predatory policing. And this is an important and timely topic because far too often communities of color, Black, Latino, and Indigenous have had consistent interactions with law enforcement that is far from fair, just, or equitable. So in the moment we find ourselves in, these issues are being illuminated in ways that were previously taken for granted. Social media has helped to elevate the lived experience and realities of people and communities on the ground in ways that have never really penetrated the minds of white mainstream society. Now I realize that for many people, any critique of law enforcement will be met with anger and fury. However, critique and accountability are absolutely necessary, especially because law enforcement is a foundational component of US society. It is a bureaucratic entity with the legal authority and administrative discretion to enforce law and disperse punishment. The weight of this responsibility should not go unnoticed, nor should it be taken lightly. However, there are longstanding discrepancies with respect to how law enforcement engages with people from diverse backgrounds and diverse communities. So to better understand this racialized history, particularly as it is experienced by communities of color, it becomes important to understand how police evolved. Historical patterns influence our contemporary realities, but too often we only focus on here and now without understanding how we got to this place. The one thing that I want to say is that so often public administration is taught in a very acontextual and ahistorical way. And as a result of that, we never really take into account the social, the economic, or the political context for how our institutions evolved or why we make decisions as administrators. And so the history and context for law enforcement becomes very important in this conversation. So before law enforcement became the profession that we know today, its origins need to be understood. Connie Hassard Walker notes that policing in Southern slaveholding states had roots in the slave patrols, that squadrons were made up of white volunteers who were empowered to utilize vigilante tactics to enforce laws related to slavery. And this policing preceded modern day police brutality against African Americans. This is the start of the pattern. Newly emancipated Black men were criminalized for any number of subjective behaviors to restrict the right to vote, which included but weren't limited to vagrancy, unemployment, and loitering. Sociological studies of Black life throughout the 19th and 20th century explicitly discuss how violence was incited and the harassment that occurred when police patrolled Black neighborhoods. Black codes were almost exclusively enforced on Black people, which introduced them to the criminal legal system. So a group of scholars who use the term criminal legal system to refer to the fact that rarely is justice served for people in communities of color. when they interact with this infrastructure. So ultimately, the Black codes unlocked the 13th Amendment loophole, which allowed for the prisoner, quote unquote, slave relationship to legally reemerge in society. Under these conditions, individuals could be leased to companies for pennies on the dollar. The practice is also known as convict leasing, and is currently being capitalized on by public entities and private companies to this day. So when we think about felony convictions, both then and now, they've specifically created barriers which would restrict access to the ballot. It would limit employment opportunities, dictate where people could live, and the types of benefits that they could receive from government. All of these things have significant implications, not only for the individual, but also their families and the collective community for which they reside in. The state of Florida is a prime example for how this plays out. Community organizers have worked for years to get a constitutional amendment on the ballot to restore the voting rights of returning citizens. In 2018, by a margin of 64.6%, Floridians voted yes on Amendment 4. However, after several appeals by the Florida legislature, they have essentially reinstated the poll tax, whereby in order to vote, returning citizens must pay all their fines and fees. Why is this significant? Well, not only is this an election year, but Florida is often a swing state. And currently in Florida, there are approximately 1.6 million people, approximately 10% of the population, who are disenfranchised from the right to vote. The racial implication of that means that 21% of all Black people in the state of Florida are disenfranchised. So to reiterate, predatory policing isn't just about incarceration, but the comprehensive ways in which people of color are denied access to, or denied their humanity and restricted from living their full and authentic lives. The association between Black identity and crime has grossly been exaggerated and often justified with falsified data. Our research has shown that crime rates and drug use among Black and white communities are equal, but emphasis has focused on reinforcing the stereotype of Black criminality. A report from the Hamilton Project states that Black and white Americans sell drugs at similar rates, but Black Americans are 2.7 times as likely to be arrested for drug-related offenses. This doesn't take into account the sentencing disparity between crack and powder cocaine. The Drug Policy Alliance reveals that people of color experience discrimination at every stage of the criminal justice system. They're more likely to be stopped, searched, arrested, convicted, harshly sentenced, and saddled with a lifelong criminal record. Research shows that prosecutors are twice as likely to pursue mandatory minimums for Black people versus white people for the same offense. Black people and Native Americans are more likely to be killed by law enforcement than other racial and ethnic groups. The United States as a country incarcerates more people than any other industrialized nation in the world. The Sentencing Project estimates that nearly 2.2 million US citizens reside in the nation's jails and prisons. These rates are higher than the nations of El Salvador, Rwanda, Russia, Brazil, and China. And in this country, we would call those repressive regimes. And I wonder, to what extent are those similar conversations happening around the world about our system of incarceration? The National Association of State Budget Officers report that state expenditures for corrections in 2018 exceed $60 billion, with a B, dollars. States are committing sizable portions of their budget annually to support the criminal legal infrastructure and the system of punishment. The Sentencing Project notes, the trends have resulted in prison overcrowding and fiscal burdens on states to accommodate a rapidly expanding penal system, despite increasing evidence that large-scale incarceration is not an effective means for achieving public safety. At a time when we're making peak investments in crime prevention, it's also the time where data has been used, or at least can reveal that crime is on the decline. History tells us, and research has shown us, that Black spaces have been the space or been the place for heightened police surveillance. The Justice Mapping Center calls million-dollar blocks, and it's the place that the Justice Mapping Center calls million-dollar blocks, which refers to the areas where more than $1 million is being spent annually to incarcerate residents in a single census block. So multiply those census blocks or census tracts across urban area after urban area, and you can begin to understand why there's such a vested interest in the prison industrial complex, mass incarceration, the school to prison pipeline, and criminalizing behaviors rather than rehabilitating people. This speaks to the racial disparity in sentencing. 1 in 3 Black men are likely to be incarcerated at some point in time in their lifetime. 1 in 3, that's 33%, when compared to 1 in 17 with white men. The gendered experience falls along similar racial lines. 1 in 18 Black women are likely to be incarcerated in their lifetime, compared to 1 in 111 white women. If we think about this from an intersectional perspective, the results of the 2015 transgender survey reveal that transgender women of color, specifically Black and American Indian women, are more likely to be incarcerated, are 3 times more likely to be incarcerated than their white transgender counterparts. So within a capitalist economy, the ability to exploit prison labor for massive profits have become the standard practice across the sector. The state of California uses prison labor to fight wildfires. In Georgia, inmates produce signage, build furniture, and even provide moving services. Industries from manufacturing to farming across the country are making billions of dollars annually off of prison labor. And so at one point we were concerned about the offshoring of jobs to other countries. Now we see that there's such an incentive for the use of prison labor that many jobs are being confined within the walls of the jails. Ironically, despite developing skills while incarcerated to produce goods and services, those skills can rarely be applied to the formal economy once these folks are released from prison. The stigma of incarceration and the check-the-box mandate on many job applications further marginalize returning citizens. Collectively, this reality increases the likelihood of recidivism. So to have a conversation about predatory policing, there's so much more that needs to be unpacked. Because this conversation is not just about law enforcement, but the myriad of actors and institutions that benefit from the revolving door of incarceration. The intersection of race and control and power are at the crux of the disparate experiences Black people have with state actors. Black people have historically and contemporarily they have been socially constructed as undeserving, as deviant. At one point in time, they were deemed as property, so less human. This speaks to the pervasiveness of discrimination and inequitable practices, and also the unconstitutionality for which practices have been inflicted upon them. Law enforcement has aided in those practices because they aid the state in the systemic control, containment, surveillance, and harm of Indigenous people, Black people, Latino people, LGBTQ people, and all of those other folks that are at the intersection that have marginalized identities. I recently concluded a study funded by the Department of Justice. My colleague and I examined the perceptions of LGBTQ people of color, the perceptions LGBTQ people of color had with the New Orleans Police Department. We used a framework of intersectional subjection because we were interested in the ways for which people with multiple marginalized identities interacted with the police. We wanted to understand how authority figures, in this case police, would exercise their power to enforce rules and policies. So over the course of 2 years, we got an opportunity to engage with so many different people. We interviewed participants and they gave candid accounts of their impressions of and their stories related to their interactions with the NOPD. I will pull a few quotes verbatim. One said, "A police officer asked me for my phone number and sex and said he would let me go. This instance reminds me of Oklahoma officer Daniel Holzclaw, who was eventually convicted of rape, sexual assault, and battery after assaulting 13 low-income Black women." The second quote, "The NOPD saw a trans girl and said, 'Look at these men in wigs on Bourbon Street.'" Now, when we talk about systems of oppression, there is a normative context for the ways in which people should appear in society. Under the CANS law in New Orleans, CANS stands for the Crimes Against Nature by Solicitation. This was a law that was differentially applied to Black trans women and to white trans women. Black trans women who were sex workers were consistently convicted with a felony, which created a host of challenges when they were trying to navigate not only the criminal legal system, but society at large. White trans women who were convicted or who were stopped for sex work were often charged with a misdemeanor crime, essentially giving them a slap on the wrist. The third quote says that if you're young and Black in the city of New Orleans, you're a suspect. And this relates back to this earlier idea that criminalizing Black identity is more the norm than not. So these statements reflect the increasing tension and hostility that exists between residents of color who identify as LGBTQ and the police. The overarching theme of the research relates to the pattern and practices of predatory policing behavior that have authorized police to use their discretionary authority to create differentiated experiences for people with marginalized identities. The Kerner Commission report published in 1968 warned us that the role of police had been in legitimating state-sanctioned violence in quote-unquote ghetto communities. So whether we're talking about Tulsa, Oklahoma, Rosewood, Rock Spring, or the 16th Street church massacres that occurred largely without any interference from law enforcement to halt such violent protests and killings. Subsequently, the pattern of racially selective policing in protest situations exacerbate tensions that undermine the legitimacy of the agency's claims that it serves and protects all. We currently see this playing out in the civil unrest with the police brutality in Black Lives Matter. The juxtaposed police response to Black Lives Matter protests has resulted in the implementation of Operation Legend by Trump and the federal law enforcement officials. This law and order agenda sought to quell civil unrest in response to police brutality. For example, in Portland, plainclothes officers were rounding up protesters for mass detention without ever formally charging them. This was a very different response from federal government when white armed protesters stormed the state capitol in Michigan, when Governor Whitman enacted a stay-at-home order in response to the earlier responses to the coronavirus pandemic. ICE is another example of the harsh and inhumane treatment. The zero tolerance policy for which families have been separated at the border is devastating. The recent allegations from whistleblowers that ICE officials are forcing sterilizations on immigrant women is unconstitutional. The rampant spread of COVID without appropriate treatment is illegal. Despite these criticisms, ICE and federal agents are quoted as saying they're just doing their jobs. The ability of law enforcement professionals to absolve themselves of the harm and violence inflicted on people because you are just doing your job is extreme and perverse. Sadly, society has largely condoned this behavior because the population being affected does not look like them. I'm immediately reminded of the parallel situation of government actions in Nazi Germany, and we know how this turns out. To add insult to injury, there's a lack of accountability for harm, for murder, for torture, when those who are interacted with law enforcement, with those who interact with law enforcement, particularly because the courts have protected them through the doctrine of qualified immunity. According to Ristroff, the constitutional doctrine that purportedly regulates police forces may not reflect racial animus, but it does reflect a normative judgment about the distribution of violence. The perceived gains in public safety and effective law enforcement, of the expansive police authority are worth the cost of this authority because it's imposed on people of color. Furthermore, Gross states that the doctrine of qualified immunity and the Fourth Amendment's reasonableness requirement creates a hazy border between excessive and acceptable force, where the split-second judgments of police officers are rarely questioned by the courts. So despite the fact that use of force policies have been updated and adopted by law enforcement agencies across the country, the court's interpretation have been far more subjective, which makes it almost impossible to convict a cop of wrongdoing. Reasonableness, as it's articulated, protects all but the plainly incompetent for those who knowingly violate the law. The latter aspect almost serves as a cornerstone for the immunity defense because it is widely known that police officers are not adequately trained on use of force provisions. Therefore, so if use of force standards are not clearly known or understood by police, if those protocols are not explicitly articulated and agreed upon by the courts, rulings are grounded within circumstantial and situational context. Additionally, the burden of proof remains on the victim to demonstrate officer incompetence or lack of knowledge of the law, which again is almost impossible to prove. Why is this important? Because qualified immunity essentially shields government officials broadly, but law enforcement officers specifically, from liabilities for violating a person's constitutional rights. Consequently, officers are rarely penalized for killing citizens in this country. Additionally, financial penalties are recouped from taxpayer dollars and never from the police agency budget or union coffers. So time and time again, taxpayers, especially Black and Latinos, are footing the bill for the reckless and sometimes murderous behavior of police officers. On one end, they're paying their salaries, but on the other end, those tax dollars are used to pay out settlements for police misconduct. For example, during fiscal year 2019, New York City paid $175.9 million in judgments for police-related claims. Los Angeles County budgeted $148.5 million during fiscal year 2018-19 for officer misconduct judgments. In Chicago, in 2018, $85 million of taxpayer funds were used to settle police lawsuits. And just recently in Louisville, it was announced that the city would pay $12 million to Breonna Taylor's family. These stories are abundant, these wounds are deep, and the legitimacy of our administrative state is in jeopardy. The pattern and practice of predatory policing implicates many institutions and actors across society. This reality is diametrically opposed to everything espoused in the United States as fair and just and democratic. If healing in our country is to occur, there has to be some admission of and reckoning with the state-sanctioned violence that has afflicted people and communities of color. Thank you.
Thanks very much. And that was a really, dispiriting, of course, but very helpful, multifaceted sort of discussion of the various levels of the challenges of the police system and fairness towards people of color. So I'd love for people to throw out some questions in the chat, and I think this is a very good opportunity. I'm happy to call on people in order. Maybe I'll kick things off while we wait for people to let me know that they want to ask a question. So, we talk a lot in policy programs about, framing and framing issues to policymakers. And I think in a lot of ways you've done a superb job of, framing how many challenges there are around this. I'm just wondering in your work if you've encountered particular frames um, around getting people both aware of, but maybe willing to think about change with respect to some of the issues that you've talked about. So what kind of framing works to get people who might not know about the problem or might be ambivalent about how they stand to the police. What kind of framing do you think has worked or can work for countering it and getting more people on board?
I think that's a great question. So while my engagement, as I mentioned, the project done in New Orleans just concluded this past summer or last summer, but all of the kind of logistics had just ended recently. So with respect to law enforcement in that regard, the framing is usually around the fact that people just didn't know, right? And so this was like the open secret in communities of color with respect to how police officers engaged and what those relationships or interactions look like. I think social media has created a space where more people, mainstream society, understand or are able to see for themselves, because so much of it is, that's not my experience when I get stopped by the police. I think you're exaggerating. It doesn't happen, right? Or you must have did something wrong, or you should have just listened to what the officer said, and that way you wouldn't have died, right? Or you wouldn't have been injured, right? And so I think the framing becomes a bit difficult when the adverse actions are systematically happening to people who don't look like you, right? And so as an example, I think of the work that I was doing with returning citizens, and the way for which those organizers were able to get people on board for restoring voter rights was to listen to those lived experiences, right? And so people, formerly incarcerated people, would participate in these town halls and have conversations and talk about all of the obstacles that they faced that people just didn't know about, right? So for example, to be convicted of a felony in a certain state not only means that you can't vote, but it also means that if you have family who lives in public housing, you also can't go visit them because there are restrictions on what their residence is and who can visit, right? And so as I think about this, it really is trying to get people to understand from the lived experience, which is why it's so important. That context is missing in so much of our research because we are focused in on the numbers and the quantitative piece and the statistics, but there are stories behind those numbers that need to be told that we often don't want to take the time to learn about, to develop, and we don't, as researchers, oftentimes aren't trained to be able to go out in communities to create spaces where conversations can happen openly and freely, and where people want to trust and talk to them and open up to them to begin to bridge these gaps.
Great, thank you. So we have a few questions, and again, I especially, I know there's a lot of students here, and this is a great opportunity, I think, to ask some questions. One of our students, Mina, just wanted to know whether your study for the Department of Justice has been published and is publicly accessible.
It's currently under review, so as soon as it comes out, I will share it with you all.
Okay, great. And my screen just went blank, but I think we have a question from Madeline.
Yes.
Go ahead and ask.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Professor Blessett, for being here. I'm a student at the UC Riverside School of Public Policy, and I think this issue, especially right now, is so important. One of my professors always told me that implementation can be the most difficult part of public policy. So I'm curious if, in reaction to the Black Lives Matter movement, we do get various statewide or even national policy, if you think we'll be able to implement it, if we can actually hold every precinct of police officers accountable, and maybe how we can do that at a local level.
That's a great question. That's $1 million question. I think that there are lots of policies that exist on the books that seek to push equity and justice. the problem is implementation, right? Because there's so much discretion afforded to administrators with one, how they interpret it, right? So we're not even talking about state policy or federal policy. So if we were talking about a policy that was enacted in the state of Massachusetts, right? Not sure how many law enforcement agencies you have, but there are going to be that many different interpretations of that policy. And as a result, there are going to be a myriad of resources for how that policy can be interpreted, right? And so I think a step back from that would be having conversations about how the bureaucratic institution manifests itself to produce issues of equity. How are people trained, right? How do people understand issues of inequity? How do we understand the bureaucratic structure as facilitating inequity, right? Because so often within public policy and public administration schools, the values that we are taught is effectiveness, economy, and efficiency. Equity is an afterthought, right? Equity is never a part of how we understand our roles as administrators. And because of that, it becomes very, very difficult to, after the fact, say, we have this plan or policy in place, we're going to implement it. Oh, by the way, we should focus on equity, right? So if the plan and it's outright isn't explicit in having a racial equity outcome, then it's going to be even more difficult to implement. And I want to say one thing that, if you look at policies on the books, most of the policies don't specify racial disparity. Like, we are going to target Black people, right? But if you look at stop and frisk in New York City, if you read the policy as it stands, there's nothing about it that says we're going to target Black and Latinos, right? Black people and Latino people. But the reality is, as it was practiced, as it was implemented through the discretion of law enforcement officers, then you saw that through the run of stop and frisk policy, that Black and Latino people were predominantly those residents who were stopped by that policy, right? And so it's not necessarily an issue of implementation. It's really understanding how to write policies with equity always at the forefront of its creation, and therefore being able to create accountability structures for the implementation, if that makes sense.
Thanks for that. So we have a question from Ellie O'Donnell and then from Justin Gross.
Yeah, thank you again for speaking to us. It's been a great conversation thus far. My question was, what do you think the results of the upcoming election will have on the Black Lives Matter movement directly? And if there is a new president installed, is there anything that he can do to, make a difference?
That was a loaded question, Ellie.
Yeah, I typically have a lot of those.
I think the presidential election is extremely important, right? Particularly because when we think about, so over the weekend, we lost Justice Ginsburg. As I mentioned in my talk, right, the Supreme Court has largely interpreted qualified immunity in such a way that it makes it almost impossible to convict a police officer for blatant and outrageous behavior, even when it's filmed on camera, right? I think this is a turning point, right? And I don't say that with hyperbole. I think that the fundamental tenets for which this country exists is at stake, given the fact that the current administration going into a second term really is upending and uprooting, really undermining all of the kind of standard protocols, procedures, and policies that were in place to make this society fair and just and democratic, right? And we've never really achieved those ideas, but we were a lot further along 4.5 years ago than we are in this moment, right? So with the election of a new president, I think that I'm not going to say that, a Biden and Harris ticket is going to stop everything immediately, right? The damage in a lot of ways has been done. There's momentum to continue this practice. We've seen hate crimes go up. We've seen all of these different kind of vigilante responses to the rhetoric that is coming out of the White House. And so I think that there's an opportunity to kind of stop the bleeding in a lot of ways. But unless there is going to be some serious reckoning with how communities of color are engaged, I don't foresee immediate changes with respect to how law enforcement responds, right? We haven't had an investigation into the Department of Justice since Obama left office. So Chicago was the actual last report that was produced by the Department of Justice to look at the patterns and practices of unconstitutional police behavior. Who knows what is happening or has happened over the last 4 years? And so I think if we can get back to a baseline level of accountability, of investigation, I think that puts us in a good space. But just the changeover of presidency or the changeover of the office isn't going to immediately stop or change anything. I think it really is going to require sustained effort and engagement, not only from the presidency, but from all of us as citizens, to really force the hand to vote in different prosecutors, to be mindful of the ways for which our local political actors are creating policies, implementing policies, and affecting our lives on a day-to-day basis. The federal level is one role, but all politics is local. So what are we going to do at a local level to make these changes more effective?
Thank you.
Hi, thanks for joining us today. We're really happy to have you. I just wanted to continue on extend something that David brought up in terms of thinking about framing. I'm wondering, there was initially just a surge of public opinion support for Black Lives Matter. Occasionally we have, especially under the pandemic, some initial story that people are reacting to before echo chambers try to strategically reframe. And so I'm thinking about this kind of tension between, and really like what we can kind of do about this, but the of sort of strategic reframing of issues of predatory behavior by police or police violence. And, on one hand, trying to represent it as acts of a few bad apples, sort of making it more particularistic or anecdotal, or sometimes in framing theory, we talk about episodic versus thematic. And so, taking individual cases and saying, well, it was just this bad cop or that bad cop. And then on the other hand, and that seems to be a threat as we think about how public opinion is now declining on this, and say Fox News and others have had a chance to sort of chime in. But then on the other hand, also taking incidents of protests and cherry picking examples of violence or examples that could say kind of portray the reaction against police violence as just being chaos and so on, and how in a very segmented society we communicate with one another and pursue a framing that's going to be more helpful.
That's a great question. The Fox News echo chamber is massive, right? Like the misinformation, and don't get me wrong, I say Fox News because that's the best example that I have, but CNN, NBC, all of those places, right, are speaking to their respective audiences, right? And creating a frame around the narrative that their audience supports, right? But the misinformation that occurs, particularly with Fox News, is troublesome, right? I don't know. I mean, I think in a lot of ways, it's beyond. I'm not going to say it's beyond framing, because the few bad apples is, sure, we talk about a few bad apples, but we don't allow a few bad apples in the medical profession. They would just lose their jobs, right? Like there has to be some broader sense that this is not behavior that will be condoned at all, right? And we can't have this conversation without recognizing the influence of money and the influence of the FOP, Fraternal Order of Police, in dictating what is deemed as acceptable, what they're able to get away with, the relationship that police officers have with prosecutors, and that whole, again, criminal legal infrastructure, right? I'm not sure, I don't have a background in framing, so I can't like present this to you in a way that would be consistent with the framing theory. But for me, these conversations about bad apples we're arguing about oranges when I'm talking about apples, right? It I just read a wonderful article that theorized bureaucratic organizations as racist, right? Phenomenal, right? Because part of this conversation recognizes that the language that we use, the policies that we implement, and the ways for which those things manifest itself through these racial schemas that we have in society really continue to reinforce ourselves, and so, or reinforce themselves, right? So it doesn't matter that you have a predominantly Black law enforcement agency. The bureaucracy of it will continue to reproduce inequities regardless of who is at the top, right? Diversity isn't the thing that's going to save us. And so I would take a step back and ask us to reframe our understanding of organizations within the context of being constructed under systems of white supremacy specifically, and begin to unpack those ideas in a way that would allow us to rethink institutions, to rethink our language, to rethink our actions in response to what we're supposed to be doing as administrators.
Thank you.
Sorry, I was frozen for a second. So we have 4 more questions in line. We have Jada, Selfie, Vivek, and Khalif. And I also want to mention that well, we normally will stop at 1 on the dot. We might go a few extra minutes because I know we've got 4 good questions, and we're very happy to hear from you. We're grateful for you. Okay, so Jada, Selfie, Vivek, Khalif, feel free to ask your questions.
Hi, I'm Jada. Thank you again for this great presentation. It's very, very nice to meet you. Wish it was in person, but definitely a great presentation. So I just have a quick question. You spoke about raising awareness due to the fact people don't have the lived experience, but I guess I'm just wondering, how do we promote that awareness without re-traumatizing communities impacted? And I guess I asked that question because you spoke also about the healing and the reckoning, and I think that can be very nuanced, right? A couple of classmates and I are doing a research study on the psychological effects of trauma porn on the Black community. So it's like, how do we continue raising this awareness without traumatizing communities impacted or continuously sharing graphic videos of violence against Black individuals or people of color? What are the alternatives, if you can think of any?
That's a wonderful question. You know, when these incidents happen on social media, it's like, oh my God, I can't believe it. And then it's immediately reshared, right? The entire video, right? And it is traumatizing over and over again. I will say that again, a lot of my experience in bringing people along with controversial topics relates to my engagement with the returning citizens in Florida. And I think that there are people who are open and willing to share their stories and experience, right? And those are the people who we should be going to. I don't think we should be exploiting people and their lived experience in a way as a means to an end. But I think that if there are people who are interested, who feel that their voice or the way for which they can engage an audience or illuminate what some of their challenges are, I think that becomes a really good space to build on. To begin to share that lived experience and to make people more aware of these issues. I think the racial, when you talk about the trauma, I think the reckoning does have to occur, right? And on the one hand, while there are so many videos and so much research and so many stories out there about what these experiences are, it's still always those people over there, instead of like, because I've never seen that, or I don't know anyone who's experienced it, it doesn't impact me in the same way. And so I would think about, you know, locally, if there were people who could create, and maybe even thinking about a blog, a newsletter, a podcast or webinar series, right? Like in the era of Zoom, right? People have gotten creative. Everyone can do things in a different way. Art is another way for which these stories can be told and can be made accessible to people who don't want to read or who don't want to be traumatized by the words in the discussion, right? And so if you think about image, like, what's the name of this book? Marking Time is it's a book that was recently released, but it is infused with not only art, but poems and all of these things to talk about how people who are incarcerated are navigating the system. And so I think we just need to be open as a society. There's more than one way to make the message accessible. There's also more than one way to think outside of the box in order to create space for people to learn and to grow. The question becomes, if you're there to learn, be there to, don't be defensive, like really be there to learn and engage and really try to take what's being said and figuring out how you can use your sphere of influence to affect change in a meaningful way.
Hi, it's nice to meet you over Zoom, and thanks again for talking. So, the questions that I had is, I was wondering if you could go a little bit more in depth in terms of what you were saying about ICE, and then I also, the other question I wanted to ask was, have um have how does the legalization of marijuana in some states impact this issue of mass incarceration?
Thank you for that question. I'll start with the second question first. I think it depends, right? So Colorado was one of the first states to legalize marijuana, but you still see that Black people are still being incarcerated more than their white counterparts in the state where it's legal. So it's like, what's the issue, right?
Yeah.
So I think that's extremely problematic. But I think in California, what they've done in a lot of ways to, in a restorative justice kind of effort, has been to, for those folks who were convicted or went to jail for crimes related to drug distribution or drug use, they are a part of a cohort that has been given resources to develop seed programming around the growing, the development, and the distribution of marijuana, right? And so in a lot of ways, they've been given priority to start these businesses, which is crazy, right? You have white folks making millions of dollars selling weed when, Black, people have been doing this all along and been going to jail for decades, right? Like the hypocrisy of it all is extremely problematic. And so I think that those are two states that are one, it's legal, but we're still harassing Black people. In California, don't get me wrong, they have a whole bunch of other issues, but at least in that regard, with that particular example, they're trying to right some of those wrongs. With respect to your second question in ICE, where do I start? Where do I go? Their practices have been to basically round up people who, starting from Sheriff Arpaio in Arizona, right? Papers, please, like having the eminent discretion to say, you don't look like you belong here, so show me your papers, right? It has just been exacerbated in the border states across the country in response to this idea that, immigrants coming from the southern border are thieves, are rapists, are murderers, as been articulated by the president, right? And so, and those people are doing their jobs, and since I mentioned, I'm just doing my job, so I don't necessarily see the inhumane treatment that of what I'm doing. I'm just doing my job. So,
thank you.
You're welcome.
Hi, thank you for this conversation. My name is Vivek. I'm a student from the School of Public Policy at UC Riverside. My question for you is, we've seen disbanding the police as like a widely floated solution to whatever we've been seeing in the news now of this predatory policing. Is there merit to this idea, or does this work to just alienate those who don't share the same experiences as the communities of color experience with police? Is this just like an extremist view, or does this idea hold water?
I think it could hold water. I think now here's a framing thing, right? Like I think when you talk about disband or defund the police, right? The conversation isn't disband the police, it's defund the police, right? I mentioned earlier that states have allocated upwards of $60 billion for incarceration. What would happen if we took $60 billion and invested it in recreation, in workforce development programs, in public transportation, right? We're the only industrialized nation. I'm not going to say the only, but when you think about an industrialized nation, to not have light bullet trains and all of these other ways for which public transportation can exist in its many manifestations, it's extremely problematic, right? There becomes an opportunity cost for where people, or a residential mismatch between where people live and where opportunities are, right? And so I think that if we talked about defunding the police as an opportunity to reinvest in some of these other social infrastructures and programs, then that's a way for us to get at the fact that we want to invest in criminalization and incarceration and not in human capital, right? The communities that are suffering the most are underinvested. They're underdeveloped, right? They don't have the same access to resources that suburban or affluent communities have. And if you look at the way that communities are funded, you see the racial disparity in and of those funding and budgeting decisions. And so what does it mean to defund the police? I mean, do police need a $300 million budget annually? Probably not, right? If we were to move those resources into these other social spaces, right? Think about mental health, think about homelessness. All of these behaviors have been criminalized because we don't have facilities or spaces to help support people when they need it the most. And so, I think if we want to reframe a discussion, defund the police maybe isn't the way to get people on board, but maybe reinvesting in all of these other things may be a different point of reference that people could buy into.
Thank you.
So hi, my name is Khalif. I'm a first year graduate student at UMass Amherst. And thank you for coming to speak with us, Professor Blessett. My question pretty much, it jumps off of the last question that was asked. And I'd like to know, do you think police reform is going to be enough to combat predatory policing? Or do you think that we need to look at alternatives to community safety altogether? And then do you think these two concepts can happen at the same time?
I think we need to look at community or public safety differently altogether, right? I'll give you an example. In New Orleans, having a conversation, conducting an interview, and a woman talked about the fact that if she were raped, that she still wouldn't go to the police because she could be equally traumatized by the investigation of police, right? I had another woman talk about the fact that someone had broken into her house. And instead of calling the police, she pled with her colleagues or her neighbors to help address the situation because she was terrified that calling the police would result in a death, right? And so when these are the realities of people who already have marginalized experiences with the police, and the fact that they are still mindful that engaging or calling the police to a particular event could end in death, could end in trauma, could end in all of these other kind of harsh outcomes, I think we need to begin to rethink policing in and of itself. Going back to this idea of defund the police, if we were reinvesting, most of the time these crimes are happening because communities are ill, right? Communities aren't healthy. The things around them, the institutions and structures around them don't facilitate them living a full and authentic life. So if we were to reinvest in communities in a way where there was recreation, where there was healthy food, where there was access to preventative care, not treatment after the fact, and I think that we create a community that is able to sustain itself, that is able to thrive in a way where crime isn't the focus, right? Or where these dysfunctions don't illuminate themselves in such a concentrated way. And so I don't know, reform is such a vague term. Reform could be anything. So I'm not going to advocate for police reform. I really want to know, what does reimagining the system of public safety in this country looks like, honestly, right? I don't think this is going to happen within the context of our current law enforcement bureaucracy. I just don't think it's possible. I'm sorry. I realize that this is a somber conversation, right? I don't have any solutions for you in a way that you want me to have, but I think that the beauty in this is that you all are professionals. You will interrogate these things. Khalif, you're a first year student, right? Like this is the work for which we will all do together in reimagining what society will look like. There is no hard and fast answer to most of these questions, because we didn't get into this overnight, right? We're not going to get into this. We're not going to get out of this within the next presidential cycle, right? Like these are systemic issues that require us to consistently, every single day, work to unpack, to reimagine, to be open and creative about what solutions look like. Our one best way is no longer the approach. Like I implore you as students in this program to be open to doing things differently, right? To pushing your professors on the call, to be thinking about ways for which we can reimagine society and really pushing the envelope, because we've always done it this way and this is where we are. So we have to think of a new way.
Thanks very much. And all I can say is amen to that. I think, here at SPP, we share the concerns around systemic structures of oppression and social injustice. And I think this has been really, I think it's appropriate for us to take full measure of the difficulties of the challenges that we face, whether it's police brutality or, economic racism, whatever it is. And at the same time, I very much appreciate your call for all of us, and certainly the students, to help us reimagine. And, it's something I know we're going to try to do throughout everybody's time in the program. So with that, a couple quick things. I just want to remind you that our next event is October 19th, and we'll have Professor Gilda Daniels speak about another, very difficult problem, and the problem of voter suppression, but one I think we all need to hear a lot about. Secondly, I want to mention that we have, as you've seen, we have some students joining us from UC Riverside, and so thanks for getting up and sharing your morning with us. It's nice to have new people, joining us in the community. Finally, I just want to thank you very, very much, Professor Blessett, for taking time to join us, for kind of inspiring us, and help again keep in mind that we've got a fire lit, that we have to keep burning this year, and really doing what we can, both in learning and outreach, to try to do more. So I hope we'll be hearing more from you. And a number of the students have asked to see the studies when they're released. So we hope you'll keep an open line to us. And yeah, thanks everybody so much.
Thank you all so much. I appreciate your time. It was a pleasure to be here today.
All right.
Thank you for being here.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Bye.
Bye. Have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.